The air in the park was crisp with the early signs of autumn. Leaves scattered across the pathway, their brittle edges crunching softly underfoot. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where time stretched thin, giving everything a slow, dreamlike quality. People passed by in the distance. An elderly man walking his dog, a mother pushing a stroller, but none of them seemed particularly noteworthy. It was the kind of stillness that made the smallest details stand out. That was probably why the wallet caught my eye. It sat alone on the bench, half hidden in the shadows cast by the overhead trees. At first, I almost walked past it, assuming someone had simply forgotten it there. But something about it felt strange. It wasn't the kind of modern, synthetic wallet people carry nowadays. The leather was cracked and aged, darkened by time, with stitching that looked hand-sewn rather than machine-made. It had a weight to it, a presence, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it. I hesitated before picking it up. It was lighter than expected, but still solid in my hand. The flap was secured by a small brass button, dull with tarnish. When I undid the clasp and flipped it open, a distinct smell rose from inside. Old paper and something faintly metallic like rust. Inside, there wasn't much. A handful of coins rested in a small inner pocket, their surfaces worn smooth. A silver quarter, a penny so darkened it was nearly black. The dates were old, all from the 1940s and 50s. Beneath them, tucked carefully into a narrow slot, was an identification card. The edges were rounded with age, the paper yellowed and fragile. The name read Thomas R. Whitmore. The picture beside it was a black and white portrait of a young man in a suit, his hair neatly combed back. His expression was unreadable, lips pressed into a faint line, eyes slightly shadowed. There was something unsettling about the way he was staring into the camera. Not nervous, not happy, just watching. I turned the card over, running my fingers over the faded ink. The issue date was 1956. The realization settled in slowly. The wallet had been sitting there as if it belonged to someone who had just stepped away, yet the ID inside was nearly 70 years old. It should have felt silly. There were plenty of ways an old wallet could end up here. Maybe someone had lost it ages ago, and it had just been kicked around, only now surfacing. Maybe it was a collector's item, misplaced by an antique enthusiast. There were logical explanations. Still, my fingers tightened around it. Something about it felt recent. Fresh. The coins inside weren't caked with dust, the ID wasn't crumbling apart, and the leather, though aged, wasn't brittle. It had been used recently. Handled. Carried. Curiosity pulled me in. I retrieved my phone and typed the name into a search engine, expecting to find nothing. Maybe an old census record, a meaningless obituary, or a scrap of history buried in some forgotten database. But there it was. The first result made my stomach knot. Thomas R. Whitmore died 1973 in house fire. Cause: unresolved. I clicked the link. The article was brief, a grainy scan of an old newspaper clipping. A fire had engulfed a small house on the outskirts of town, reducing it to little more than ash. 3 bodies were found inside. The article didn't specify the other victims, only that Whitmore had been one of them. It had been ruled an accident. Faulty wiring, they suspected, but there had been whispers of something more. Unofficial reports claimed the fire had started too suddenly, burned too hot, consumed the house too completely. There had been no survivors, no explanations, just a house, a fire, and a man who should not have been able to leave a wallet on a park bench in the year 2025. A sharp breeze cut through the trees. My grip on the wallet tightened. I glanced back at the bench. It was empty. The wallet was gone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My fingers still tingled where I had held it just moments before. The weight of it had been so real, the texture of the leather so distinct, and yet, nothing. No sign that it had ever been there. The bench sat as it always had, quiet and unremarkable, surrounded by shifting autumn leaves. And yet I knew I had held it. I knew what I had seen. The name, the ID, the picture of a man long dead. And now, all that remained was the faint impression of warmth against my palms, as if something had just been taken back. The missing wallet should have been the end of it. A trick of the mind, a fleeting oddity that would fade from memory. But the name lingered, Thomas R. Whitmore, pressing against the edges of my thoughts like a splinter beneath the skin. There was something unfinished about it, something that gnawed at my sense of reason. The more I tried to dismiss it, the deeper it burrowed. That night, I searched again. The obituary had been easy to find, but the details were sparse. Just a short paragraph acknowledging the fire and the loss of the Whitmore family. The way it was written felt cold, clinical, like the event had been quickly swept under history's rug. It didn't sit right. I kept digging, sifting through old records, local archives, whatever scraps of information remained. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Whitmore hadn't been the only one in the house that night. His wife and young daughter had died alongside him. The reports all agreed on that much. What they didn't agree on was how the fire started. Some articles claimed it was faulty wiring, a tragic accident in the dead of night. But there were inconsistencies, mentions of unusually high burn temperatures, a fire that spread too quickly for the supposed cause. One article, buried deep in a forgotten digital archive, hinted at something darker. Arson. An anonymous witness had told police they saw something that night. A figure standing outside the house as it burned. Watching. Waiting. But no suspect had ever been identified, and eventually, the investigation had been closed. One detail caught my attention more than the rest. The location. I had assumed the Whitmore house had been somewhere distant, long demolished or rebuilt. But the address, now just an abandoned lot, was only a few blocks from where I lived. I had passed it countless times without a second thought. I needed to see it for myself. The lot was smaller than I had expected. A skeletal fence lined the edges, rusted and half-collapsed in places. Weeds had overtaken what had once been a yard, wild growth pushing through cracked pavement and tangling around the remains of a crumbling stone foundation. There was nothing left of the house itself. No charred beams, no remnants of walls. Just an empty space where it had once stood. It was as if the fire had erased everything completely, leaving only the hollow imprint of something that should have been. As I stepped closer, the air felt different. Still, too still. The city was never completely silent, not even at night. There was always the distant hum of traffic, the occasional murmur of voices drifting from nearby streets. But here, the quiet pressed in thick and suffocating, like the world had been muted. Then I saw it, a flicker in the air. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the street lamps glow refracted through the shifting branches. But it wasn't that. The flicker was within the lot itself, pulsing faintly, like the dying embers of a fire that had never fully gone out. A glow without a source. It licked at the edges of the empty space where the house had stood, faint and fleeting, disappearing the moment I tried to focus on it. But it was there. Something still burned here. A sound broke the silence. Not loud, not obvious. Just a soft shift, the barest disturbance in the heavy air. A movement within the lot. I wasn't alone. I turned, pulse hammering. At first, there was nothing. Just shadows cast by the skeletal remains of trees, their gnarled branches stretching over the lot like clawed fingers. But then, a shape, a shadow that didn't belong. It stood at the far end of the lot, near where the back wall of the house would have been. Tall, still, watching, my body locked in place, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't, because even from a distance, I could see the outline of a suit. A suit like the one in the photograph. Thomas Whitmore. The name burned in my mind like the fire that had taken his home. I blinked. The shadow was gone. The lot was empty once more. Only the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. The night felt heavier when I returned home, as if something had followed me back from the lot. Every sound in my apartment seemed sharper. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floor beneath my steps. The unease from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper, threading itself through my thoughts. I tossed my keys onto the counter and turned toward the sink, reaching for a glass. That was when I saw it. Sitting on the kitchen counter, where I had never placed it, was the wallet. It shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have been anywhere. I had seen it disappear. I had watched the empty bench, my fingers still tingling from where I had held it. But here it was exactly as I'd found it before. The same cracked leather, the same tarnished brass clasp. The room felt colder as I approached it. The weight of it was familiar when I picked it up, yet something felt off. Heavier, somehow. Wrong. I flipped it open. The ID was missing. The slot where Thomas R. Whitmore's name had been was now empty. A blank space where proof of his existence had once rested. But something else had been left behind. A single folded piece of paper. Yellowed, brittle at the edges, as if it had been left untouched for decades. I hesitated before unfolding it. The handwriting was jagged, ink pressed deep into the paper, the strokes almost too heavy, as if written by an unsteady hand. I never left. The letters crawled across the page, uneven and frantic. The ink bled slightly, as if the words had been written in desperation, or in something wetter than ink. A sound broke the silence. My phone. The screen lit up with an unknown number. No name, no location. A static-filled pause met my ears as I answered. No voices, no automated messages, just a distant, low crackling. Then, beneath the static, another sound. Fire. The unmistakable hiss and pop of flames licking against wood. The collapse of burning beams. The slow, consuming destruction of something that had once stood whole. And then, a whisper. Soft, deliberate, barely audible over the roar of fire. The words stretched, distorted by the interference, as if spoken from somewhere just beyond my understanding. Come find me. The line cut out. The silence that followed felt wrong. My skin prickled, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I should have left it alone. I should have thrown the wallet away, erased the name from my memory, let whatever this was slip back into the past where it belonged. Instead, I turned back toward the door. The lot wasn't far, and I knew now I was never supposed to find the wallet. It had found me. The night air pressed against me as I stepped onto the lot. The same eerie stillness lingered, swallowing the distant city sounds. The ruined foundation lay before me, half buried beneath weeds and time, exactly as it had earlier. Then something changed. A ripple in the air, like heat rising from pavement, but colder, unnatural. The empty lot shimmered, bending the darkness around it. My breath hitched as the ruins shifted, outlines sharpening, colors deepening. And the house was there, whole, intact. It stood exactly as it must have decades ago, untouched by fire or time. The white siding gleamed faintly under the streetlights. The windows glowed with the warm flicker of lamplight. A radio played from somewhere inside, soft jazz drifting through the night like an echo from the past. The front door stood wide open. The sight of it should have sent me running. Instead, I stepped forward. The air inside was warm, comforting, thick with the scent of something rich and buttery. Roast chicken, perhaps. A faint trace of cigar smoke lingered beneath it. The wallpaper was a gentle floral pattern. The hardwood floors gleamed as if freshly polished. Everything looked lived in. Whole. The living room held a plush green couch, a coffee table lined with old magazines. A record player spun a vinyl, the melody faintly crackling beneath the static. The dining room was set for four. 4 plates, 4 glasses, silverware neatly placed atop folded napkins. But the food was untouched, plates full, glasses filled, as if someone had just stepped away from the table and would return at any moment. But there was no one here. The silence stretched long, the house watching me as much as I watched it. My pulse thundered in my ears, but my feet carried me further inside. Then I noticed the mirrors. They were everywhere, lining the walls, tucked between furniture. Old, framed glass that wavered slightly, distorting the room at strange angles. I turned toward the largest one, an ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. I wasn't in it. The reflection showed the room, the couch, the record player, the table set for 4, but I was missing. Gone. But something else was there. The walls in the reflection weren't soft and floral. They were blackened and burned, charred wood and crumbling plaster barely holding together. The floor was covered in ash. The furniture, nothing more than skeletal remains. The house was on fire. Not here, not now, but in the reflection. Flames flickered in the glass, devouring the space where I stood. Shadows writhed beyond them, figures thrashing inside the inferno. And then, from within the flames, something moved. A shape emerged from the smoke, its form blackened and broken. It shouldn't have been standing. It shouldn't have been looking at me. But it was. The figure took one step forward in the mirror, then another, closer. Its face was a ruin of burned flesh, its mouth fixed in something that could have once been a scream. It lifted a hand, bones exposed through cracked skin, reaching for me. Not in the mirror. Behind me. I turned. The house was empty, but the mirror still burned, and the figure in the glass kept watching. A sudden gust of heat rolled through the room, thick and suffocating. The air itself ignited, walls curling inward as flames roared to life around me. The soft glow of the house was gone, replaced by the relentless hunger of fire. The ceiling blackened in an instant, paint bubbling and peeling away, revealing the scorched bones of the house beneath. The mirrors shattered one by one, their surfaces cracking under the growing heat. In each fragment, I saw different moments of destruction. Flames consuming the floral wallpaper, shadows writhing behind closed doors, a child's doll melting into an unrecognizable shape. And then, amid the smoke, he appeared. Thomas R. Whitmore stood across the room, untouched by the fire. His suit was immaculate, his features eerily calm. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor beneath his feet. He lifted a hand and pointed. Something under the floorboards. My body moved before my mind could catch up. Splinters tore at my fingers as I clawed at the charred wood, prying up a loose plank. Beneath it, buried beneath the ashes of time, was a small metal box. The fire raged around me, consuming everything but the space where I knelt. The box was warm against my palms, but not burning. The latch was stiff with rust, resisting at first, then giving way with a soft, reluctant click. Inside, a stack of letters and old photographs. The first image I saw was of Thomas Whitmore, younger, standing with a woman and a little girl. His family, their smiles frozen in time, unaware of what would come. The letters were hastily written, ink smudged, pages wrinkled as if they had been gripped too tightly. The words blurred together in frantic desperation, but the message was clear. He had been murdered before the fire. The house hadn't simply burned. It had been destroyed to erase something, to erase him. The heat around me grew unbearable. The fire was closing in, swallowing the last remnants of the past. The walls groaned, beams collapsing into themselves. Then, a shift, a snap, like the world being yanked back into place. The fire was gone. I was kneeling in the middle of the empty lot. The night was still, the air cold. The remains of the house had vanished, leaving only the ruined foundation and the whisper of something lost. My hands were empty. No letters, no photographs, but something remained. A burnt ID card. I lifted it with shaking fingers, the edges crisped and blackened. The name had changed. It was no longer Thomas R. Whitmore. It was mine. A weight settled over me, cold and final. I understood now. I was never supposed to find the wallet. The wallet had found me. The next day, in a quiet park, a man on his morning walk noticed something unusual on a bench. An old, worn leather wallet. He picked it up, and the cycle began again.